All right, let's go ahead and get started. How's the rest of everybody's syllabus week been? Anything particularly traumatic or exciting? Nothing? Cool. All right, so on the syllabus, it mentions you need a clicker. Has anybody bought a clicker through the bookstore? If you have it here, can you hold it up so I know what it looks like? Cool. So for those of y'all who have not yet bought a clicker, go ahead and either buy the clicker through the bookstore, or there's an app you can download on your phone. It's called, at least on the Apple Store, Turning Point, and it's a hexagon with different colors on it. I want to do just a quick test run. This won't be for any credit or anything, but if you have your clicker here, go ahead and pull it out. All of y'all should have gotten an email with notification to sign up for this class, or you're enrolled in this class. Did anybody get that email? Did anybody know they for sure did not get the email? Okay. If you didn't get the email, check whatever email would be attached to your name within Canvas. And if you're still not getting it, send me an email and we will figure that one out. But if you have your clicker, go ahead and pull it out. I want to see if it's going to do what I think it's going to do. Just quickly go ahead. Session ID 115009. What's the channel? Does it not allow you to just put in a session ID there?
That's only for mobile.
That's only for Apple.
Oh, somebody voted. The person who successfully voted, was that via mobile? Yes, okay. All right, well, I clearly have things to figure out. This has been a successful test run. We will get that squared away. All right, now you can put your clickers away. Thank you for attempting to vote. All right, so show of hands who wants to go to grad school. Who wants to go to grad school and into a profession that's research related? Wow, only like 2 of y'all? Okay, well, nonetheless, if y'all want experience for grad school and or want experience for what research would actually look like, I need a couple RAs for this semester. I'm recruiting across classes. Let me just tell you quickly about the research I do. And so if it interests you, come up and chat with me after class. But I run what we call the Attack Lab here, because I came from the Air Force Academy. Everything has to be an acronym, and so I created an acronym for the lab here. It stands for Advanced Teaming, Technology, Automation, and Computing. And what we're focusing on is the interactions between human, AI, automation, and robotics. And so looking at kind of the human-machine teaming aspect of interaction, I have had engineers, have had computer scientists in my lab, graphic designers, psychology majors. And so if you're at all interested, come talk to me and we can get you involved in the research, doing some pretty cool stuff. Depending on how long you stay in the lab, may have opportunities to publish and or go to conferences as well. So yeah, come play with cool toys and hang out with me regularly. All right, here's your fun fact of the day. Chunks of whale puke sell for as much as $150,000. Apparently, after aging, the chunks become known as ambergris. I don't know, ambergris. Developing a sweet, musky smell, highly sought after by high-end perfume manufacturers. So, if any of y'all own high-end perfume, you may be squirting whale puke on you. What's that?
There's also whale excrements, the same thing too.
Oh, so you get both ends of the whale. Awesome.
Oh well.
Oh well. Yeah. All right. So, remind me, show of hands, who's a psychology major? Cool. Who's a psychology minor? All right. So, for the rest of y'all, I'm going to try to convince you throughout this class that whatever major you selected for yourself is the wrong one, and that you need to transition into a psychology major, or at least think about a psychology minor for all the cool things you can do with it, and why it's such a cool field to actually study. So, let's start off, why even study the brain? Well, one of the really neat facts about the brain is the unbelievable complexity of the system itself. There are more neuronal connections in the brain than there are stars in the Milky Way galaxy. That's over 100 billion connections in your brain, being put to good use watching things like Keeping Up with the Kardashians. And it's far and away the most impressive computer we know of. Right? We think about all the amazing computational capabilities of actual computers that we've developed, synthetic systems. Even as we pursue artificial intelligence, we are still well behind what the human brain does just on its normal trajectory. And to illustrate that, let me highlight a really simple demonstration. So, do any of y'all have really young siblings or nieces and nephews that play with Legos? And if they leave it on the ground and you step on it, it's an incredibly uncomfortable sensation. But think about what happens in that instance when you step on a Lego, right? You're walking along, your brain is already doing an incredible amount of computations, but you're walking along, and as soon as your foot touches down on that Lego, information is being sent right up to your brain to say, something's not right here. And it usually waits for the pain signal to readjust because you get fluctuations in your environment, so you're not changing all that much. But as soon as your brain receives the pain signal, it reverses course in a fraction of a second to tell the muscles in your body to retract the leg that you were just placing to capture all of the weight in your gait, to contract your abdominal muscles to counteract for the balance, to allow you to come back. It allows you to make a threat assessment as to whether you need to turn tail and run. Was it a snake you stepped on? Or was it a Lego? I mean, it's doing all of this in probably about a fifth of a second. And it's telling your body what to do without you even thinking about it. And if you want to realize what an unbelievably complex computation this is, go to YouTube and type in Boston Dynamics. It's a robotics company out of Boston trying to make a bipedal robot that can do relatively similar things to what humans can do. And watch how many times it fails. I mean, despite all the computational capabilities you would want, it still fails frequently. It struggles with the balance issues that we're able to perfect relatively easily. Right? It's an amazing thing that you're able to walk and talk, that I'm able to put my foot here and just stand while I'm talking to y'all, making all these micro adjustments in my ankle so I'm not falling down and embarrassing myself, knocking myself out in front of the class. One of these times I'm going to get so old that I actually do that and do fall down and break my hip or something like that. But, I mean, it really is amazing all the additional things that your brain is doing in this situation. It's not like when you step on the Lego, all of a sudden your respiration stops and your heart rate stops and your brain focuses all of its capabilities on that instance. It's continuing everything it needs to keep you alive while still making those micro adjustments. If I say, here, catch. You reacted, but in that moment, you had to make a threat assessment of A, what was I throwing at you? B, how hard was I throwing it at you? C, who the hell am I? Why am I up here throwing things at you? Is this a threat? You need to get out of here? And then, after all of that's processed, and you've made the decision, do I need to get out of the way? Do I need to catch it? Do I need to deflect? Your hand then comes up to attempt to catch it. And you weren't even looking at me when I threw it at you. So you made that entire calculation in about half the distance from me to you of me underhanding this marker. Right? I don't know if it's possible for me to convey how stinking cool that is, that this organic system exists and governs our day-to-day life of our navigation out in the world. It allows us to understand depth. It allows us to see color. Color doesn't exist. Color is a phenomenological experience based off of different wavelengths. Your brain is making up stuff to help you understand the world. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the research I've done in the past about how it's actually changing the world. So what you see in the world is not what I see in the world, right? This is answering the age-old question every little kid has of, how do I know your blues are the same as my blues? Right? Does everybody remember the dress from a few years ago? Oh, yeah. We can explain that with perceptual distortions. So maybe at the end of the day, I'll tell you how it works. If not, I'll just keep promising to tell you next class so you come to every class. Bribery works. All right, so how do we study the brain? Well, if you're a psychology major, or even if you're not a psychology major, I'm sure you've heard this idea that the soft sciences aren't really science. We don't think of psychology, I'm saying we collectively as a society, frequently don't think of psychology as a science because we don't directly observe the phenomena that's inherently observed in other more typical hard sciences than the soft sciences. In astronomy, you can see and chart the movement of planets. You're directly observing what's going on in the real world. Chemistry, you work directly with the elements. Again, it's a direct interface with the phenomena you're studying. Physics, you can actually observe and measure the effects of A on B. But psychology is unique in that we're measuring a phenomenon we can't observe, we can't see. We can see the secondary consequences of what we're interested in studying. But I can't open up your skull and see what you're seeing. Even with neuroimaging, I'm not able to get really anything besides what parts of your brain are active. I can't tell what you see. I can't tell what you're thinking. I can't tell how you're processing your environment. And so when you think about sciences and the distinction between the hard sciences and the soft sciences, hard not meaning difficult science, and soft not meaning, a non-real science, but it's the discrepancy between directly observing and measuring phenomena versus trying to infer about the phenomena that we are interested in. And there are different approaches to psychology, and we'll talk a little bit about the chronology of that. Some focus on just the behavior of the individual. If I throw a marker at you, what is your behavior? What is your reaction? We call those people behaviorists. Some focus on observing social behavior. And so they're interested about interpersonal dynamics, interactions between individuals. We call those social psychologists. Now, the discrepancy between social psychologists and sociologists tend to study social interactions at a cultural scale, a larger scale, community, whereas social psychologists are interested in principally the individual, understanding, predicting, explaining each principal component of that greater overall organism that is the culture. And then some focus on trying to infer what happens as the antecedent to behavior. So what's going on in your brain? That's what my training is. We're called cognitive psychologists. It's also kind of bunched in together with neuroscience. So whereas cognitive psychologists tend to focus more on the processes, the understanding of thought, the neuroscientists try to understand the mechanisms What parts of the brain are activated when you're thinking about a loved one, etc.? And this by no means is comprehensive, but it should give you an idea as to the breadth of options out there for psychologists. So most people think about psychology, as we said last time, at least professions, they think of therapists, or they think of researchers. But a main dichotomy exists within the field of psychology of, do we care about the actions, or do we care about the thoughts which lead to the actions? And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. But when most people think about psychology, they either think, what happens when things go wrong? Depression, anxiety? Or they think, what are people thinking? What's going on in their head? And so to study psychology, it's really important because we're making these inferences about the data rather than directly observing the phenomena itself, that we're good critical thinkers in the field when we look at the data. You know, I've got a saying that data doesn't lie, but people do, and people lie about data whether or not they actually mean to. It's not always intentional, but the same data can be interpreted in many ways depending on your biases, or even agenda, or perhaps an accident. Right? And so it's absolutely important, especially, again, in these soft sciences, that when we're looking at data, we're making sure we're thinking critically in an important and scientific manner, rather than just allowing whatever the data come out to be to confirm our worldview. And this goes without saying, but I think it's really important to harp on, that to be a good critical thinker or to be a good scientist, you have to be willing to accept any conclusion, right? You have to be willing to say, okay, that is in fact the state of the world. And so it's one of the issues I personally have with some avenues of research of confirming people's worldview. Say, okay, well, what if those results had come out another way? Would you be comfortable with what that would be telling us about the state of the world? You can think about a lot of potentially controversial or even political topics that can get researched. And you think about, okay, what if the data had come out the other way? Would we as a society be comfortable with that conclusion? And again, just to illustrate, I'm sure many of y'all have seen this similar thing before, but the same data looked at from different people with different agendas, different perspectives, also different slivers of a ground truth, can yield much different experiences of what that truth is trying to tell them. Right? And so if you think about a whole bunch of blindfolded scientists trying to figure out what an elephant is for the first time, somebody who only has access to the tusks is going to think it's a weapon or it's a spear of some sort. Somebody who only has access to the tail may only think of it as a rope. Right? And so it's critical to think about, okay, what is the unifying theory here? How can we gain access to as much information as possible when inferring about things we can't see, like the cognitive processes? One of the things an undergrad professor told me in, I think it was a social psychology class, was be an inquiring skeptic. Right? Being a skeptic is easy. I'm sure everybody has a friend, and you may even be that friend, that is just dismissive of everything, or poo-poos whatever you say or bring up. Say, I don't believe it. That's easy. But being an inquiring skeptic, the flip side of that is, what questions do I need to answer to figure out if this is the actual truth? So there are going to be a lot of things I'm telling you in this class, or that your book tells you in this class. And most of them it's my perception, are scientific consensus. But take what I'm saying, not necessarily with a grain of salt, and filter it through your kind of inquiring skeptic mind. What does that mean? Does that really make sense to you? If not, go find the data on your own. We can talk about how to find these research articles. Or something I'm saying is wrong, absolutely let me know. If you find data to disconfirm what I'm telling you, let me know. I would much rather issue a mea culpa up here, I was wrong, than continue to teach things that I'm wrong about. And so observe the world, collect the data, think critically about the data. The data can tell many stories at once, and the accepted interpretation may not be right. And so my favorite example of this is with a paper that is often cited as being representative of what we call the Yerkes-Dodson law. So the Yerkes-Dodson law is an inverse relationship. I don't know why they had to lower this the way they did, but is an inverse relationship between performance and arousal. And we don't mean sex. That was entirely predictable. We don't mean sexual arousal when we talk about this. We mean physiological arousal. Heart rate, blood pressure, adrenaline, things like that. And so what proponents of the law state is that as arousal increases to a point, you have enhanced performance. At a certain point, though, you get too worked up and your overall performance decreases. This paper has been cited, I think, 10,000 times. Everybody refers to it as the Yerkes-Dodson law, relating arousal and performance. Here's the kicker. Nowhere in that paper does it use the words arousal or performance or stress or anxiety. It's a paper about rats learning how to go through a maze. And so the scientific community has accepted this alternative narrative about the paper because not enough people are saying, let me actually go read the paper and see if it's saying what we think it's saying. So again, if I'm saying something to y'all and that doesn't make sense, or you know otherwise, bring it up. Let's have a conversation in class. And here's an example. Is anybody familiar with what a correlation is? I'm seeing kind of a half hand in the back. Oh, you're just stretching. Okay. Yeah?
It's when two things are related, or they look like they are.
Exactly.
But they might actually be.
Yeah. So we talk about two types of correlations. Positive correlations and negative correlations. And that's not a value judgment. Positive means they both go up together and they both go down together. So an example of a positive correlation would be height and weight. As you get taller, you also tend to weigh more. A negative correlation is as one goes up, the other goes down. And so that may be temperature and hot chocolate consumption. In the depths of summer here, you're probably not drinking many cups of hot chocolate. The problem with these types of correlations is if you have enough data, you can find correlations, relationships between data that have absolutely no relationship. They just co-vary together. Sometimes they go up, sometimes they go down. And if you have enough data points, you can find these really strange relationships that people misinterpret as a ground truth. And so I pulled a couple of these from one of my favorite websites that has all of these spurious correlations. This one, if you can't read it, is per capita cheese consumption with the number of people who died by becoming tangled in their bed sheets. It's possible to interpret this as one causing the other, but it's probably not a whole bunch of people who go on murderous raids fueled by blocks of cheese. Here's another one. Age of Miss America correlates with murders by steam, hot vapors, and hot objects. Again, I don't think there is a murderous contingent there of people who get really angry when Miss America gets to 25 years old and then goes and murders 8 people. It just co-varies together. The problem is, if you're not a good inquiring skeptic, if you're not thinking critically about this, you'll accept what are, in my estimation, irresponsible reporters reporting on relationships that were not actually reported in that fashion in the actual article itself. So, here's an example from Vox, citing a paper that said people in big cities tend to live longer. And Vox interpreted that as, if you move to a big city, you're going to live longer. I don't think it's merely the fact that if you move out of Huntsville and drive 3 hours to Atlanta, all of a sudden you're going to live longer. Right? We can think about other relationships that may be affecting this. Maybe in a big city you're just walking more. Maybe you have access to more healthy foods. Here's another one. Fan in room seems to cut infants' risk of crib death. I don't know how Tara Parker Pope thinks that works, in that just staring at the fan somehow makes the baby less risky, less willing to roll over on his stomach, something like that. Again, it's a correlation. It doesn't mean it's a causal relationship. Here's another. Tooth loss in elderly linked to mental impairment. I don't even know where to start with this one. If there was going to be a causal relationship, it's likely that mental impairment leads to tooth loss, not necessarily that tooth loss leads to mental impairment, because if y'all haven't figured it out yet, your brain does not reside in your teeth. Diet of fish can prevent teen violence. So do we just have to go to the inner city and feed them a whole bunch of salmon? Probably not. There are probably other relationships at play here, other effects. And so it's really important, if you take nothing away from this class other than this sentiment, correlation does not imply causation. Right? And so when you see articles that say eating cashews linked to living longer, it's probably not the cashews themselves that are making you actually live longer. Medical research is particularly prone to this type of correlational distortion. Questions so far? Awesome. Has anybody heard of other correlations that are obviously not causal that they like? Yeah.
Ice cream sales and shark attack deaths.
Yeah. So the real mechanism there is probably it's summer, right? You're going to get in the water. But that goes all over the place. No, eating ice cream is probably not going to increase the likelihood that you get attacked by a shark. All right. So how did we get to where we are in psychology? Well, we started off with this whole principle of what we're calling behaviorism. So again, it's this idea that all I care about is your behavior. I don't care about the antecedent cognition or your thoughts. I care about how do you react. And so when we think about behaviorism, kind of one of the first bigwigs in behaviorism was a man by the name of B.F. Skinner. And he popularized this idea of operant conditioning. Can I change an animal's behavior based off of a series of rewards? So if you've ever had a dog that you've trained to do something, that's operant conditioning. Interestingly enough, I think it was World War II. B.F. Skinner was employed by the U.S. military to create an early analog of like heat-seeking missiles. What they would do is put a pigeon in the front of a bomb that would peck at different points around a circle to get the bomb to adjust its course and target a certain building. They didn't really get employed, but you can think about some of the clever ways in which, beyond just training your dog to sit, you could use operant conditioning. Behaviorists believe that psychology should be the study of observable behaviors and that introspection doesn't matter. What do I mean when I say introspection? Is that a hint? Give it a shot.
Introspection is just kind of looking deeper, looking into yourself.
Yeah, thinking about what's going on inside. So again, behaviorists think we don't have to care about what goes on inside, we just care about what's that behavior. I don't care what my dog's thinking when it sits, when I tell it to sit. All I care is that it sits. So you have your input or your stimulus, and then you have your corresponding behavior. And all that behaviorists would argue is that psychology should be an attempt to study, predict, and shape behavior. And you still see some of that in academia today, but also out in the real world. I want people to stop smoking. How do I get them to stop smoking? I want to shape, predict their behavior. So take a couple minutes and discuss with your neighbor, do you think introspection matters or not? Why might we want to rely on introspection? And why might we not want to rely on introspection? So talk with your neighbor, and then we're going to bring it back together real quick. All right, wrap up your conversation. So who's figured it out? Does introspection matter or not? Yeah. Kind of. Pick a side, man. We're at war.
I think it's positive, but the negative to it is introspection. It's just kind of one person's view on it. It could be different for different psychologists.
Yeah.
It's not that reliable.
Yeah. So his answer was he thinks it's kind of important, but it's just one person's perspective, the introspection, and so it may not be that reliable. Who thinks it is important? Why?
I mean, somebody's motivations for doing something are going to be different than somebody else's motivations. And if you can kind of like get insight into that, it can kind of change how you do try to like predict and shape the behavior.
Okay, yeah. So knowing why somebody's doing what they're doing, knowing why my dog's sitting. Is my dog sitting because it wants food, or is it sitting because it wants affection, or is it sitting because it just doesn't know any better and it just does it? All right, so why might we want to rely on introspection? Why would it be a useful thing to have in the real world? Yeah.
If you can observe the processes going through your own mind far more accurately than you can observe going on in other minds.
Yeah. So you can observe what's going on in your own mind a lot easier than what's going on in other people's minds. But what about if we're extrapolating that to me studying you introspectively? Like relying on you to tell me what's going on inside. Could be lying, yeah. So understanding people's motivations for their behavior. Are they responding a certain way because that's what they truly believe? Or are they responding a certain way because they want you to be happy and they're a people pleaser? That's an important thing to know because pulling somebody outside of a lab environment may have different consequences once you are actually in the real world. Why might we not want to rely on introspection? Why, instead of asking you what you think about something, should I just see what your behavior is?
It's opinionated.
It's opinionated, yeah. People frequently don't know what they think, right? And so, in a famous study, researchers quickly popped up a picture of two different people. We're talking for a fraction of a second. Put them down. I said, okay, which one was more attractive? Participants picked one. And then the researchers either put up the picture that the participants selected, or they put up the other picture. They said, okay, explain why this person's more attractive. And they came up with reasons. And you would expect those who were shown the picture again that they selected was more attractive to have good reasons. But the people in the group who were shown the other picture didn't say, that's not who I picked. They said, oh, I picked this person because of their jawline, and I really like the way their hair is styled here. You come up with excuses or reasons post facto to justify what you're told to believe, right? And so frequently, this also has the same thing or a similar effect on like taste or preferences. You can be told what you think and then justify that. It's a whole principle in psychology we call cognitive dissonance. And so if I want you to believe in something, all I have to do is say, why don't you play devil's advocate for a second? Why don't you argue this position that I want you to believe? Give me a couple reasons for why you think that. And after that, you are substantially more likely to believe that thing that you didn't believe before just because I told you to argue in favor of it. So if you really want to screw with your friends in political conversations, have them start arguing your position just to give me a point. What do you think I'm valid about? And slowly over time, you can get them to flip their political affiliation or belief about something based purely on this principle of cognitive dissonance. And so, response to behaviorists falls into what we call this kind of black box problem. So we have the input and stimulus, and we have the behavior. And that's all behaviorists care about. But a group of psychologists come along and say, we don't care about the mechanism, right? You're telling me, hey, here's a car, go get in it. You see it drives. We don't really care how it works. But what about when that car breaks down? We want to know how it works. What's going on? What are the idiosyncrasies of cognition that may affect some of those behaviors? And so this black box is that cognition, that cognitive response to behaviorism. Right? So we have the input and stimulus, and we have the output, but now we're really interested in what's going on in your mind to transform or make sense of that input and stimulus to elicit that specific response. So, a good example of why this may be relevant, my dog comes when I call him 9 times out of 10. When he doesn't that one time out of 10, it's not because he doesn't hear me. His behavior doesn't match what I understand his behavior to be when I give him that input and stimulus, but it's because he's got another motivation. He sees a squirrel go up a tree. Now, all of a sudden, he doesn't want to come. It doesn't matter how good the treat is. He's got a separate motivation. His cognition is manipulating his behavior, the outcome, based off of his cognitive or subjective experience. So again, behaviorism led researchers to suggesting maybe not necessarily that Skinner was wrong, but it was wrong to think about only behavior. That what really matters is, in addition to the behavior, having that cognitive manipulation, that cognitive understanding of what's going out or going on in the world. So how can we learn about cognition? Obviously, again, we're not going to crack somebody's head open, and even if we did, we can't see what they're seeing, we can't think what they're thinking, but we observe behavior to then infer cognition. We give a series of stimuli, we see what the outcome is, what the behavior is, and from that, we try to make that inference about what was going on in the person's head. So, what does that mean? I mean, how can we infer cognition from behavior? That's kind of fuzzy and ill-defined. Yup. Yeah, that's kind of the problem, right? That's one of the issues for psychology. There are a lot of possible interpretations. But that's where repeated iterations, peer review, critical thinking, all in an attempt to rule out alternative explanations, come into play. So in grad school, I studied what we call action-specific perception. So for the longest time, we thought that how you see the world is the same as how I see the world. Right? It's the same information coming in, hitting our eyes. We have the same brains, not the exact same brains, but the same processing capabilities. But then 20 or 30 years ago, people started realizing that there were spatial distortions associated with your ability to act. So, who plays a sport in here again? What sport do you play?
I ran track.
Track, that's right. So, they ran a study with folks before and after a long run. They said, okay, how far away is this object? Look at that. Or how steep is this hill? And they said, okay, now go on your run. And then they came back. After they came back, they said, all right, now how far away is that object? How steep is that hill? After they had just exerted themselves, after they had that energetic depletion, all of a sudden, that object looked further away and that hill looked steeper. Does anybody play basketball in here? Golf? Baseball? Softball? Nothing? Wow. Well, I'll give you the facts anyways. So, your ability to hit a baseball or a softball, your ability to putt into a cup, your ability to kick field goals into the uprights affects your perception of the size of that. Right? And so, Babe Ruth once said after a game where I think he hit like 3 home runs, they said, how are you doing this? And he said, I can't explain it. The baseball just looks like a grapefruit. Right? And he wasn't lying. I mean, that's not a distortion of his words. That's really how his perceptual system, how his visual system was distorting his environment. Because he was so successfully able to hit the ball, his brain was distorting the size of the ball. Your ability to putt into a cup can distort how big or small you think that cup actually is. And so these are cases where, we had them go out and run. We had them provide some sort of behavioral response. So in some cases, it was look at that object, now close your eyes and throw a beanbag to that object. Because, right, verbal responses can be inherently distorted. Maybe you know what the purpose of my study is, so now you're just going to tell me a different distance. And so by having you perform some sort of behavior, some sort of action on that object, I can now infer your perceived size or your perceived distance or your perceived hill slant. And so another example of this, think of the steepest road in the U.S. you've ever driven or walked up or down. Now give me an estimate. How many degrees do you think that hill was? Somebody give me an example. Somebody take a shot.
35.
35 degrees. Does anybody have an experience they think was higher than 35? So, in most states, there's a regulation that hills can't be more than about 6 to 9 degrees. So go stand at the base of a hill or a long road that you think of as really steep and look up it and try to estimate how steep that is. And then go put your phone on it with its little degree measuring capabilities and compare that to your expectations. Your visual system is quite literally lying to you about your world, and we can get at it based off of your behaviors and your interactions with that world. So, I told you the example of throwing the beanbag, but how do I actually know that you're seeing a distances further? What sort of things do we want to know about the cognitive experience? Give me an example. Got bad news for y'all. The questions don't stop just because you don't answer them. And I'm very good with awkward silences. Ask my dates. Think critically. What can I have you do in addition to throwing a beanbag? What's that?
Like walk to something?
Yeah, exactly. So that's another thing we can do. We can have you close your eyes and now walk to it. Right? And so, based off of your calibration of your expectations of how far away that is, you may walk further if I place that object on a hill than if it was on the flat ground. Somebody else.
Point to it.
Yeah, you can point to it, exactly. So where is it in your field of view? Right? And so if you're perceiving the hill as steeper, it's going to be higher up in your field of view than if you are not perceiving it as steeper. And so from things like this, I can now get at inferring your cognition rather than just asking you to be introspective. And so one question that always comes up in psychology classes, but also in everyday life, is it nature or nurture? Is your behavior and cognition determined by your genetics, which is what we're calling nature? Or is it shaped by your environment, your nurture? Is that an answer to the question? So, who thinks nature shapes who you are, your genetics, your genes? Who thinks it's nurture? Who thinks it's a combination? Yes. Beautiful. It is, in fact, both. Let's see here. Oops. So, let's say you want to do a research project, and you want to know whether depression was caused by your genetics or your surroundings, or what percentage would be caused by your genetics or your surroundings. How might I go about doing this? Yeah?
I know there's been some studies about like twins separated at birth who like they have the same genetics, but they grew up in a different environment.
Yeah, exactly. So identical twins have the exact same genetic makeup. And so there are few cases, but there are cases out there of identical twins who are given up for adoption and split right after birth. So they have the same genetic makeup, but they have different environments. And of course, I have to reference The Office. And so if I want to see what percentage of something is dictated by your genetics, I can look at the covariance of rates of depression among these identical twins that were split up at birth. And so if both of them have depression, that lends support to this idea that depression is, at least in some degree, caused by genetics. But it's almost always both. In fact, I can't think of anything short of immutable characteristics like eye color or skin color that is only genetics. So, when Lady Gaga's song came out, Born This Way, I know it's a different political statement, but it drove me nuts because everybody has nature and nurture associated and interacting on just about everything in their day-to-day life. Even things like height that you would think are entirely genetic have an influence of nurture. That's why if you look at North Koreans versus South Koreans, the North Korean government has essentially imposed food restrictions on its people, making them very malnourished. So despite a very similar genetic composition and despite very similar ancestral backgrounds, North Koreans are about 5 inches shorter than South Koreans because of that malnutrition. And so we think about cognition and behavior. We think about different influences. We can think about biology, your makeup, your genetics, various other hormonal predispositions. Think about your psychology. So learned expectations, emotional response, cognitive processing to certain events. And also social/cultural. So cultural expectations, societal expectations, family expectations can also have these sorts of influences. Questions at this point? Cool. All right, so there's also a split between what we call basic and applied research. So applied research is, I'm sure, a lot more intuitive to a lot of y'all. It's learning in order to apply to the real world. So for example, what cockpit design in an aircraft is easiest for the pilots to use in order for them to find all of their flight instruments? The flip side, basic research, is learning for learning's sake. So seeking to understand the mechanisms of the brain without any desire for direct application of that information. So knowing things like how does a brain know the difference between a chair and a dog would be an example of a basic research question. Obviously there aren't any direct applications for knowing how the human brain can tease out a chair from a dog. You can infer secondary effects, and in fact that's where a lot of things like machine learning derive from, is understanding the human brain that was initially just basic research. But again, basic research is learning for learning's sake, whereas applied research is learning in order to know how to apply things to the real world. And we can think about this kind of quad chart, even though only 3 of the 4 of them are filled out. You can have low consideration of use, so you don't really care how that information is used, but you have this kind of quest for fundamental understanding. You want to know how the world works. The flip side of that is you kind of have a low quest for fundamental understanding. You don't really care about the knowledge for knowledge's sake, but you're really interested in how it could be used. So like Thomas Edison, inventing the light bulb. A lot of application there, not a lot of fundamental understanding or basic research interest. But then, kind of the holy grail is highly motivated fundamental research, basic research, that has obvious and direct applications. And so you can think of, I don't know if it's Louis or Louis Pasteur. This comes from the idea of pasteurizing, right? What is the principle that we need to adhere to, but there are also direct applications for the concept itself. And we're running low on time, so I'm going to speed up a little bit here. And so there are a lot of ways to apply psychology, even if you're not a psychology major. First and foremost are principles of how you can use it to help you study for this class and other classes. I think it's a disservice that you can get through your entire educational experience without ever really being taught what are these psychological principles that help you retain information, that help you study, etc. And so one concept is what we call the testing effect. And so there are enhancements in your retention based off of you being forced to recall something. So even if you don't recall it, me asking you a question makes it more likely that you'll recall it in the future. Right? You're strengthening those associations necessary for eventual retrieval. And so that's why when you go study for classes, you shouldn't just read through your book. You should make flashcards, or you should answer questions at the end of the book, or you should ask one another. And even if not that, just say, okay, I'm interested in the testing effect. Let me write down everything I know about the testing effect. You're forcing yourself to retrieve rather than just recognize. This is why I'm sure everybody in here has had the experience of saying, man, I felt so prepared for this exam, and then I went in and bombed it. Chances are, if you reflect on it, it's probably because you were reading through your notes and like, yeah, that makes sense, that makes sense, that makes sense. And what you're doing is you're recognizing rather than retrieving. It becomes a lot easier to see somebody's face and say, oh yeah, I recognize you, than it is to say, okay, what do they actually look like? And recreate that. So test yourself for the exams. Distributed practice. So if you're only going to study for 5 hours, you are much better spreading that 5 hours out than lumping it all together. So that's why a lot of your professors will say you should start studying for the exam a couple weeks ahead of time, because you're much better off just doing 30-minute chunks 3 times a week than you are 6 hours the night before the exam. I hesitate to ask this question, but raise your hand if you've ever shown up to an exam drunk. Good. Now raise your hand if you've ever pulled an all-nighter before an exam. So, here's the rub. Pulling an all-nighter impairs your abilities, your cognition, as much as if you were legally drunk. So pulling an all-nighter is functionally the same as getting drunk and then going and taking the exam. So, except for the one half hand I saw in the back that said yes, they had taken an exam drunk, the rest of y'all should think about, okay, what are the actual benefits of me staying up all night to study? And the answer is there is none. You are actually better off not studying for those 8 hours and just going to sleep than you would be if you studied for those 8 hours and then went to take the exam. Now, who, despite knowing that, still plans on pulling all-nighters? Why? Bozos. Don't do it. You can also use psychology in kind of direct interpersonal manipulations. So how do I get more money for a motorcycle I'm selling or a car I'm selling? Well, one principle is anchoring. Right? And so, has anybody bought a new car from a dealership recently? No? So I have, and when you go there, you have what we call the sticker price, right? It's the price in the window. It's the MSRP. And maybe what you hear on all these commercials of, $6,000 off MSRP. Well, it's not actually $6,000 off of anything. What they've done is they've anchored your expectations about the value of the car or the truck. So now, the truck that they're really expecting to sell to you for $25,000 says it's $30,000. You say, holy crap, I'm getting a deal. That's awesome. It's what a lot of companies will do. If you go on Amazon, it'll say, suggested list price or normal price or whatever, and then it'll have our price underneath it. It'll say 70% off. No, it's not. Don't give me that. But they've anchored your expectations, and so you're more willing to pay a higher amount than if they just said, okay, pay the $25,000 for the truck in the negotiation. Here's the best part about this, though. Anchoring can be distorted by things that have absolutely no relevance to what you're asking people to estimate. Right? And so, if I say, what is the weight of an elephant? Ask you to give me a response. And I say, okay, how many countries are in the UN? You're going to give me a higher estimate than if I said, okay, what's the weight of a mouse? And then how many countries are in the UN? The weight has nothing to do with the number of countries in the UN, but I've been able to distort your response based purely off of this anchor, this arbitrary anchor in the real world. Another really helpful technique is what we call the foot in the door technique. And so if I want your help with moving or something big, it's better for me to ask for something small and then ask you for something big. So if I wanted her to help me move, I said, hey, can I borrow your pencil real quick? Thank you. Actually, can you help me on Saturday? I need to move out of my apartment across town. You're more likely to say yes because you've already said yes to something else. You're developing this inertia of saying yes. So, if you want to date on Friday night, ask the cute person sitting next to you, hey, can I borrow your pencil real quick? Hey, can I take you out tomorrow night? They're more likely to say yes. And if they still say no, I'm sorry, it didn't work. But the flip side of that is what we call the door in the face technique. So ask for something massive and then come in with something small. Seems more reasonable. Hey, can I borrow $10,000? Can I have $20? $20 seems a lot more reasonable than if I just come and say, hey, can I have $20? No, you can't have $20. So using this foot in the door or door in the face technique to your advantage is a lot more likely to get you to do something. That's why whenever you see people either panhandling or trying to get signatures for things, they'll come up and say, hey, can I ask you a question? foot in the door. Now you're a lot more likely to acquiesce to whatever the subsequent thing they're saying is than if they said, hey, I need signatures. Can you sign this real quick? You start to identify all these little things of behavioral manipulation in your day-to-day. So here's another one. How can you convince somebody to like you or to go out with you? Things like that. Well, there's a principle of misattribution of arousal. Again, we're talking about physiological arousal, getting the heart rate up. So if you want somebody to like you or to say yes going out on a date, go on a run with them. And then hang out for a little bit. And they're still going to have an elevated heart rate after the fact, but they're more likely to misattribute that elevation in heart rate to you, the person, than to the run you just went on. Right? And so they did the study years ago by having a research assistant either stand before a bridge or after a bridge to ask people questions. And then after it, she said, and here's my phone number if you have any questions about the study, feel free to give me a call after the fact. What they found is that those who got her phone number after they crossed this large suspension bridge, this kind of scary suspension bridge, were substantially more likely to call her out and ask her on a date because they were misattributing this emotional arousal to her, the research assistant, rather than to the suspension bridge. Now, if you put her on the suspension bridge, they're going to attribute that level of arousal to the bridge. But if you're able to kind of create this dissociation while still having that heightened level of arousal, you're more likely to get them to like you or to acquiesce if you ask them on a date. So now you can go and manipulate all of your friends and then waltz right in to our chair's office and change your major to psychology, where we can teach you about all the other tips and tricks that we can't teach you about in one-on-one. So what do psychologists do and where do they do it? Well, obviously, academia is one of them, doing what I do, teaching, doing research. But also, especially here in Huntsville, there's a lot of defense-related work, right? A lot of defense-related research. How can I design the cockpits of those planes? And it is an absolute necessity. So is anybody familiar with the F-35? So it's the U.S. Air Force, in theory, all the branches, but it's the brand new fighter jet. It is an unbelievably expensive aircraft. It's a new stealth fighter. It has a suite of technologies on the helmet. Each helmet is custom fit, and each helmet costs about $600,000 for the pilots. It was an amazing undertaking by Lockheed Martin. The problem is, they delivered the aircraft. The helmet was so heavy that if the pilot ejected, it would snap the pilot's neck and kill them. Kind of a big deal. So these type of research questions are the reason why having a psychological understanding, an understanding of the human, can enhance the bottom line of any sort of defense contractor that may be here. So if you're going into any sort of engineering or even nursing, you have the opportunity to understand kind of what are the basic physiological components and limitations of the human. Political and policy research. And so some of the examples I just told you also have bearing out in politics. It's why you see people talk about focus grouping various ads. But it's also why you will see blatant attempts to manipulate people's emotional experience when tying to a specific candidate. Try to persuade people to vote in a specific way. Business consulting is a big one, and so you have the opportunity to say, okay, what are the leadership structures that we need to change to motivate the workers here? Obviously, therapy, school counseling are big ones. Things like intelligence agencies also have a really deep-seated interest in understanding human psychology. In fact, there's this whole principle of human intelligence, human, right? How do you develop a network of spies to interact out in the world? How do you manipulate people to give you information, into trusting you to deliver various information? But it also goes into the selection of people. You don't want somebody who's going to defect to another country or is going to lie to you. That's why you will sometimes see these attempts to dissuade people from lying by using lie detector tests. Here's the kicker. Lie detector tests don't actually work. They measure arousal. They can measure whether you have some degree of emotional response to a question, but they are very easily defeated, and yet we use them frequently for things like background checks. Thankfully, though, they're not allowed in the courtroom. You also have social hacking in engineering. So there's a whole profession called penetration testers who go to these different companies and try to gain access to the mainframe of these big companies or to sensitive information. And one way they could do it is the typical way you would expect somebody to hack. Another way they do it is, can I convince this person that I belong here? So I'll put on an elevator maintenance uniform, walk into the building, hop into the elevator, switch the elevator off so nobody can access it, and now I can go wherever I want to in the building, and I just change the name tag and convince people I want to be there. Right? And so it becomes really easy to see examples of people who kind of make their way in to an environment that they don't belong in based purely by acting. There was an example when President Obama was in office of a sign language interpreter who, A, didn't know sign language, B, had not been run through a background check, but he just acted like he belonged there. And so there's a speech, if you type it into YouTube, you can see it. President Obama giving a speech, and this guy's just making up signs in the side, just doing nothing. Yeah.
I think that's actually Nelson Mandela's funeral where it happened.
Well, it may happen too, but it was definitely, there was a speech with Obama. This guy may have been pulling the long con for it. I'm also willing to bet it happens frequently. But so yeah, I mean, just acting like you belong somewhere is enough to convince people that you belong at Nelson Mandela's funeral or at Obama's speech. So one of the things I love about a psychology degree or psychology minor is that while it's hard sometimes to do anything specifically related to psychology, like it's hard to be a therapist with a bachelor's in psychology, but it's applicable to so many things. Everything from sales to engineering to bedside manner with patients. So understanding human psychology is absolutely relevant to whatever career fields y'all want to be going in. And finally, are there any LSU fans in here?
I'll take them over.
Only one. Okay, you shut up. Yes. My brother went to Clemson, and so if Clemson wins, I'll give everybody in here a single point of extra credit. And yes, I am trying to bribe you to root for Clemson with the hopes that somehow that has a butterfly effect and that they can beat LSU. So, all right, without further ado, have a good weekend. See you on Tuesday.